Howdy folks, Shell Presto here again. Today I'm coloring one of my favorite subjects, Evangeline Garver, aka Corona from our East End Irregular series again. Although to most of you folks, she's probably just that redhead with thermokinesis that Presto likes to draw. I'll be using my trusty Copic markers, and I thought it would be a good time to share my personal buying tips for Copics. But first I'll comment on how I colored this piece, and how I color in general. You'll see me doing it here, and it's usually the case where I tend to shade my drawings by picking one color and using shades of that color to shade everything regardless of what color it is. You'll notice that I'm using a lot of bluish purple shades, even though nothing in the drawing is actually purple. Ava's hair is red, her skin is peachy, her costume is red and dark gray. But in addition to using darker shades of each base color to shade, I use a lot of bluish purple in all of the shadows. I think this really unifies all the different colors in the piece, or in even simpler terms, it just looks pretty spiffy. I don't always use purples, but probably 90% of the time, it's what I fall back on because it works. Now, with that in mind, what color Copic should you start with when you have a budget? And when markers are as expensive as Copics, practically everyone has a budget. I've heard a lot of artists say start with a set of cool and warm grays so you can practice and learn to blend. That's actually good advice, and if you want to take it, all I've got to say is don't buy grays that are too light. You can barely see C0 and W0, so start with numbers 1 or 2, and don't buy grays that are too close in value. You want to get a range, so skip at least 2 numbers, maybe even 3 numbers between colors. However, perhaps you want to jump straight to color. I have to say that is what I did. A lot of people will tell you to try to buy a light shade and a dark shade of every color. You know, a light and dark Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet, plus some skin tones, browns, and grays. Then all of a sudden, holy hand grenades, if I get 2 skin tones, 2 browns, 4 grays, and a black and a colorless blender to round it all out at, let's be conservative and say $6 a piece per marker. That's $132 for 22 markers, and dear Lord, why? But the real kicker is, if you do it that way, you may buy a bunch of markers, get home, and realize that you still don't have the colors you need to draw what you wanted. I suggest that before you buy a single Copic marker, you should really think about both what you want to draw right now and what you draw most often. Back when I first bought Copic markers many years ago, I was working on a Slayers fan comic featuring Zelgadis. Slayers is an anime from the 90s, in case you didn't know. So Zelgadis' color palette is silver, teal, and tan, with a bit of brass and red. Can you guess what colors I bought first? 2 cool grays, 2 blue-greens, a tan, a brown, a yellow, and a red. So 8 markers. And I was able then to use the tan and the brown to shade the yellow and the red. At the time, I was using photos of forests for my backgrounds, so I didn't worry about my background colors. But if I had been coloring my backgrounds at the time, I probably would have bought 2 greens because I did a lot of forests and trees, and otherwise the tans and browns that I already bought would have worked it for dirt and rocks, and the teals and the grays could have worked for the sky. So I bought 9 markers, those 8 I mentioned, and a colorless blender too, at about $6 a marker, spent $48, and had exactly what I needed to do for not only my first Copic colored piece, but also additional drawings of my favorite character at the time. So as long as I got creative with the backgrounds and tried to keep them in the same palette, I was good to go. And to be honest, there was so little red and brass on Zelgadis that I probably could have done without that red and yellow and just used markers that didn't blend because I wasn't doing a lot of blending in those areas on him. That was close to 15 years ago, and I shade differently now, so I'd recommend throwing a mid-range purple in that starter set too. But that's for me, and the character that I was interested in drawing at the time, and the art I was interested in making at the time. I'd like to note that if I just went ahead and bought 2 of every major color, I'd be missing the teals that I needed to draw the character as I wanted at the time. And likewise, if you're drawing characters who wear a full mask or makeup like Deadpool or Colossus or Harley Quinn, or even something otherworldly like Green Martians, you don't need skin tones right off the bat, so you can cross those off your list. So that's what I really recommend. Figure out what colors you need most to draw what you enjoy drawing the most. Try to keep it narrow and limited at first, even if you just have to focus on the next piece you want to draw. Then you can slowly buy more colors, maybe 1 or 2 a week instead of spending a whole bunch of money up front. I do strongly recommend getting a colorless blender too. Even if you don't use it to blend very often, you can use it like an eraser if a color bleeds outside a line, which you'll probably see me do pretty often in these videos. Now, once you start buying Copic markers, at some point you'll have a lot of them, and instead of buying the colors you absolutely need, you'll be looking to expand your range of colors in general. When you hit that point, you should wait on buying more colors and instead focus on getting refills for colors you already have. Usually I end up getting refills online because they're easier to find and cheaper. I'd say after you have maybe 30 Copic markers to take a break from buying new markers and make sure you get the refills for the colors that you use the most. Because nothing sucks more than being on a deadline and having to buy a second marker of a color you already have when a refill that would have been as cheap as that one marker will keep that first marker full for years. Now, there are some before you buy Copic marker warnings. Firstly, if you don't shade your drawings, if you just fill spaces with one solid color, you don't need Copics. Any art marker will do. Likewise, if you shade with a hard line instead of a soft gradient between colors, like cell shading in animation or video games, you also don't need Copics. Any art marker will do. My advice on picking color still stands, but you can save your money and buy cheaper markers that don't blend. Secondly, if you want to sell your original artwork, you might not want to use Copics. Art markers or alcohol-based markers generally contain dye, not pigment, and dye fades over time, especially when exposed to sunlight. I say this with a heavy heart because I adore Copic markers and other art markers for their ease of use, pre-mixed colors, and cleanliness. But if you put a Copic marker illustration in a frame, especially a regular frame without UV-coated glass, it's going to fade, and you should warn your customers about that. So if you want to sell your original art, you should consider a pigment-based medium like colored pencils, watercolors, acrylics, or pigment markers or watercolor markers, which blend differently than alcohol-based markers like Copics. On the other hand, if you're drawing to scan your work and make prints or publish them in a book, alcohol-based markers like Copics are great, and that's exactly why I use them. But I know that when I do a piece I want to sell or a commission, I usually use watercolors unless the buyer wants markers specifically. And finally, you should consider quantity over quality to a degree. Like I said, I bought a bunch of Copic markers close to 15 years ago. I had maybe 20. But back then, I got really frustrated by their price, and as a result of my not being able to afford a ton of markers, my very limited selection of Copic colors. It always seemed like I was missing 1 or 2 colors for every drawing I wanted to do, and especially back then, you couldn't just walk to the store and buy 2 markers. You had to order them online and pay shipping. And even now, a lot of stores don't have a big selection of Copics, if they have any at all. So I started buying Prismacolor markers, and I used markers a whole lot more then because the markers were much more affordable. And I have to say that I got much better at using markers in general with Prismacolors simply because I was drawing with markers more. And because Prismacolors were much more affordable, and because my husband has awesome friends who knew I used them, when I got married 6 years ago, 2 of my husband's friends bought us Prismacolor marker sets for wedding presents which is much cheaper than buying Prismacolors individually, and which they couldn't have done with Copics because that would have been ridiculously expensive. So their combined effort netted me over 150 colors. I used those Prismacolors often and loyally and loved them for 5 long years. I won first place in my school's art competition using them, which scored me a nice cash prize. I colored the illustrations for the second East End Irregulars book, Dismal Tide, using them. The only reason I started switching over to Copics is actually because it's harder to replace all the colors in a Prismacolor set. Certain colors are hard to find individually in stores, and Prismacolors aren't refillable. And the refillability of Copics in the long run does make them less expensive over a long period of time. So when the Prismacolor blue I used for Torrance hoodie and the Prismacolor bubblegum pink of Corona's first costume ran out, I replaced them with the identical colors in Copics. And then I slowly started buying Copics after that. But I have to say that having more colors of a cheaper alcohol-based marker can help you do better artwork compared to having markers with fantastic blending capabilities in only a few colors. One last thing, if you're not buying a set, try to buy markers in person and test a dab on paper. The caps don't always match the actual color, and your monitor may not display the colors accurately if you're shopping online. Thinking you're buying the color you need online and then finding out it's different on paper once you receive it is always disappointing. And I also know that certain stores will honor their online prices if you buy a certain amount of markers. So that's something to look into if you think the prices are cheaper online, but there's a physical store you can go to. Okay, so like I said, the only colors I use in pretty much every drawing are the purples I use for shading and the Colorless Blender. So my must-have personal markers are 0, Colorless Blender, BV01 Pale Lavender for the lightest shading, which is just the lightest of skin tones, in the lightest of skin tones, whites of the eyes, and things like that. BV01 Viola, which I use for middle tone shading, and it's the one that I use by far the most, so if you can only grab one, I would go with that. It's a nice mid-tone purple for adding shades. And I've experimented with a couple dark purples, and a few seem too dark. So I've actually got a bunch of darker purples in my collection that I just don't use as much for shading, but I'll use them as actual purples. So I'm going to recommend BV13 Hydrangea Blue for the darker shades, especially in skin tones and such. That's the one that I most recently bought and the one that I'm liking the most so far. But if you do really dark skin tones or really dark hair often, you might get more use out of BV04, and that's a blueberry instead. So that is the Colorless Blender, BV31, BV01, and either BV13 or BV04 as my must-have recommendations. And that's only if you want to shade primarily with purples the way I do. You know, if you'd rather shade with darker blues, or if you want to stick to shading with just darker tones of the colors that you're actually using, like, you know, dark brown or maroon for shading red, or orange or a tan for shading yellow, you can certainly do that. These are just the ones that I get the most use out of. Besides those colors, pick the colors you'll use the most for your favorite subjects. Okay, so that's all my advice on buying markers, Copic, Prismacolor, or otherwise. And just so you folks know, there'll be an upcoming tutorial on drawing brick backgrounds like the one shown in this finished Corona drawing here. So I hope my advice helped. And if you have any other questions, please leave a comment on the video or contact me through the ascensionepoch.com contact form, because I'd love to address your questions in future videos. Seriously, folks, let me know what you want me to talk about, because it makes dubbing these videos so much easier. And as always, liking, subscribing, and sharing on social media is how I know you care. So give the video a bit of love. And have an awesome day. Shell Presto, over and out. Okay, so this is Slayers, which was the anime that I had mentioned in the video previously, and back around my late high school and early college years, I was really into the show and the manga and everything like that. And so much so that I even did a 21-page fan comic about Zelgadis, and this is the color tone that I was talking about. So these were the colors that I was most interested in when I first started, and you can see that put to use. I had to look really hard for this, and I can't find my better example, because I did know how to blend back in these days, but unfortunately the paper that this one was drawn on was pretty thin. But that's, you know, those were the Copics I owned, and that was essentially what I used. And then I started to pick up ones that I could use on the other characters too. I still really like Slayers, and I really recommend the series, especially the early seasons. You know, Slayers Next, and Slayers Try are my favorite. Those are the first 3 seasons of the anime, the TV series. I wasn't as big into the ones with Naga, which was like Slayers DX and Slayers Special. I just like the whole team dynamic that the TV series has going on. And I'm also not too big a fan of what they did with Revolution and Evolution R. Because they felt more like a soft reboot instead of a continuation of the series. But, you know, I figured you'd all want to know that about me, because this is the internet, and I plan on making a lot of videos, so, yeah. Shell Presto Trivia. There you go. Have a good night, folks.